Yeah.
All right. Okay. So I'm just so happy to be here with you guys, and I want to say that we are really eager in the geology department at CSULB to get some internships for our wonderful students and get some big fat jobs for our wonderful students. So if you can let us know what kind of students you want, we want to make sure that we have them ready for you. So I'm on that committee. So that's my plea before I get started here. Again, I'm here to talk about the Missoula floods, but that is largely because of my wonderful mentors that I had in my PhD, and those mentors are Jim O'Connor and Vic Baker. They have been instrumental in my development as a scientist, and they have supported me in some really difficult times in the Missoula floods. Research. The Missoula floods has many amazing secrets that it gives up, but it does not give them up easily. But luckily, I'm cantankerous, and so I just I hang in there. My dad told me where there's a will, there's a way. So there's really only three things worth knowing about me, and this is how I introduce myself at every talk because it's true. I like something good to eat. I like good rocks. I like good stories, and I like good rocks because they tell the best stories. And the Missoula floods has some of the most fantastic stories. The Missoula flood research and the Missoula flood rocks are absolutely fantastic. They will tell you something that you could not even imagine. So again, let me see if I can, my mentors here, this is Vic Baker, Jim O'Connor, and Bruce Bjornstad. These are probably a lot of your FOP leaders that you've had probably for the last 5 years. They tried to rope me into leading an FOP, but I'm not as skilled as they are in the logistics. So when you do Missoula flood research with these wonderful people, while you're in the truck driving up and down and around, back and forward through Idaho and Montana and Washington, they will talk about the history of geology, and they will talk about the story of Brett's, and they will talk about all the wonderful magical things that happened before the revelation of cataclysmic flooding. And so this talk is a compilation of all of those truck rides where we were hunting for boulders, and they were so supportive of me, and actually were some of my letter of rec writers when I would apply for jobs. So the story begins with J. Harlan Bretz. You notice that there is no period here. And Vic Baker will tell you because he says there's no period. He made this name. His actual name was Harley Bretz, but he didn't think that sounded like a scientific researcher. So he changed it to J. Harlan Bretz, no period after the J. He was born in 1882, and that was during the basically the prime or the popularity of uniformitarianism. And that basically says that the key to the past is what you see in the present. And so by the nature of this human being and what he chose to do with his life and the doctrine of the time in that field of study, uniformitarianism, we were already set up for a collision to come in these two basically trains of thought. And so the beginning of my talk, you see that it is the destructive power of outrageous hypothesis. And that is the highest praise I can give a hypothesis. The destructive power of an outrageous hypothesis is that it can break down old ideas so new ideas can blossom. And this story is exactly of that. We have the destructive power of the Missoula floods that ripped through Idaho and Washington and even down into Oregon and sent sediment out in megaturbidites that are recorded in Southern Oregon. And it also was a social upheaval in the world of geology where one person had to fight for 30 years so that field evidence would be recognized. So I just want you to sit with that fact that this man was an investigator. And so Vic will talk a lot about that when we're in the truck. That the science of geology is different. It goes from the bottom up, where physicists go from the top down, where we look and we find evidence in the field. Most of the time, the evidence that captures our imagination is the anomalous evidence, the anomalous field evidence. And we say, how did that get there? And we work our way to a hypothesis that we can test. And in that way, geologists are different. And J. Harlan Bretz was a person who illustrated that quite meticulously through a 30-year journey to prove that cataclysmic flooding did indeed happen. J. Harlan Bretz was, again, a meticulous field investigator. And lucky for him, he had a stubborn streak. It was these two things that allowed him to be the person that could unveil the truth of cataclysmic flooding, that at some point the geologic community began to embrace as happening on this planet. As the ice ages came and went, so too does the mega flooding that is associated with the damming and the water and the eucalypts from underneath the ice sheets, the continental ice sheets, but also in other planets. We now know that Mars has had mega floods. Vic Baker has spent a lot of his research doing those floods. And right now, one of the outrageous hypotheses now for Mars, as Vic will tell you, is that the water actually for the mega floods on Mars comes from underneath the ground of Mars. So there's an outrageous hypothesis. And it sits there in all its starkness because the evidence suggests that it might have been. Again, we're always relating back to the field. What can we find in the field to tell us about something that we cannot imagine? It's a very interesting story here is that J. Harlan Bretz, when he first started to map the Pacific Northwest, he was looking at the erratics, and he made this wonderful map here that still holds relatively true today. And the bounds are where these erratics were found, and they were ice rafted erratics at the highest places, meaning this large boulders that had no business being in a basalt covered area were rafted and encased down in icebergs that came all the way from Idaho and Montana, 500 miles, and deposited down into the Willamette Valley, into the Kirkland Valley, in the Crab Creek track, and up near Wenatchee. He mapped this area, and in 1919, he wrote a paper. He had a paper published, and he said that the inundation from the ocean caused this ice carrying erratics to be deposited on this entire area. And he actually told Vic Baker that it was the one paper that he regretted he published. But he did not give up. He still held on to the evidence of this basically massive amount of water occupying the area of Washington and Oregon and parts of Idaho and Montana. After that paper, he was working at Chicago University, and he would take his wonderful students out to the field in Eastern Washington. And he would do this all during the early 1920s. And again, he was a meticulous observer of what we see in nature. He was writing down what nature was telling him. So by 1923, so he was looking at things like this. And when he saw maps of these things, actually, Vic will tell you this story, that he started off at University of Washington in Washington, and he took a map of this area and said, hey, you guys are the field geologists here. What do you think of this? I mean, this looks like a waterfall to me. I'm looking at the topography. Where's the river? Where's the waterfall? And they said, oh, no, that's something else. That's something else. And they poo-pooed him. And that's why he actually went to Chicago. And he was seeing evidence of high velocity scour, these cataracts that are cut back into these Columbia River basalts. These Columbia River basalts are layers and layers of basalts that were laid down between 8 and 15 million years ago. And he's noticing that there's obviously some water or something here that was taking off massive amounts of rock and displacing it, and depositing it in other places, polishing rocks and rounding features, putting down giant gravel bars like he had never seen. So he wasn't going to ignore this evidence. And here is, this is Dry Falls, this wonderful, spectacular place that now has a plaque in it to Bretz. And here is it from another angle. And you can see where the water was flowing through, and it just left this little peak of Columbia River basalt out in the middle. And all these other areas are scoured, and there's boulders in these areas. Some of them are olivine bearing. Here's another amazing cataract. This is the potholes cataract, and you can see these potholes here. These are anomalous features that no one had a way to explain. We now know that whirlpools or underwater tornadoes drill down into the basalt and just unbelievable force of nature. But at the time, there was no way to explain these things, and he was not comfortable being poo-pooed. So he took meticulous field notes and continued every summer with his students to go out here to Eastern Washington. And in 1923, he wrote 2 papers. He had 2 papers published. The first paper was strictly descriptive. He only told you what he saw. He made no interpretations because he did not know if it would make it through review. Then he became an editor at the Bulletin for Geologic Society. And once he became the editor, well, then he submitted another paper. And in that paper, he was bold enough to put his interpretations that actually this was the drainage of water that was coming from the ice margin of the southern Cordilleran ice sheet during the last glacial maximum. And this paper was not well received. And he had an idea that it wouldn't be, and that's why he made sure that he was an editor of the journal before he even submitted it for publication. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about the southern Cordilleran ice sheet. He did not have a means of the source of this fast-moving water, but he could say that he thought that it was associated with either underneath or close to, proximal to the Cordilleran ice sheet. I do know from Vic having conversations with him that he thought some of that could be related to the Okanagan Valley and coming from underneath the Okanagan lobe, which later ended up being a controversial hypothesis by Shaw. So when he talks about the source of the water that he couldn't pinpoint, he said it could be anywhere in here associated with the margin of the Cordilleran ice sheet. So he had already mapped this area, and then you saw that map by ice rafted erratics that were the bounds of the highest margins, basically the highest elevations of where the water traveled, and also the scablands or scour features that are so basically characteristic of the Columbia River Plateau in Eastern Washington. So after that 1923 paper, he was invited to give a talk in 1927, where he was ambushed essentially by 6 to 8 geologists. It appears that they were led by William C. Alden, who prepared before he even got there to discredit him. Now they discredited him because the thinking of the time as any good geologist is uniformitarianism. And this cataclysmic or catastrophic flooding was not hand in hand with that set of values. They did not see cataclysmic flooding today anywhere in the world. They had not known of it to exist in the historical record. So they simply wholeheartedly swept his hypothesis away, and he was depressed, which makes sense. I would have been depressed too, but I would have had a couple things to say. But anyway, he was depressed and he went back to Illinois. But after a while, he got it together. And for me, it's interesting to add that this W.C. Alden, who was the leader of the pack here, he was a competitor of Brett's. And he published a paper on the physiography of glacial geology in eastern Montana in 1932. So he is a competitor of him in the exact same time. And we even have a picture of his field. He was the USGS chief Pleistocene geologist of this camp here. And here's a picture actually published recently on the USGS Twitter page. So he was depressed, Brett's, and understandably so. So I don't know how I would have responded, but he did have backers. He did have people who did support him. And so there's hope, right? Science does survive one strong will at a time in these dark periods where field evidence is not being respected. And Joseph Pardee, he actually wrote a paper that characterized this large ancient lake that no longer existed, but did exist, glacial Lake Missoula. In 1910, he publishes this paper, but he makes no mention of where the water went. He, by the way, also works for the USGS and is somewhat a subordinate to the previous one that we talked about is W.C. Alden. So if he did have a hypothesis about where the water went and if it was contributing to the floods that Brett's proposed, that wouldn't have been well received at the USGS. And it just so happens that upon the day that he got his retirement papers, he submitted this paper in 1942 that talks about the giant ripple marks and the catastrophic outburst of glacial Lake Missoula, and it potentially being the source of massive floods. So from 1910 to 1942, upon his retirement, he finally could publish a paper when he was removed from underneath the thumb of the USGS and the people who were not embracing Brett's hypothesis of cataclysmic flooding. And so I appreciate that amount of spite. I enjoy it. I like it. Now here's some field evidence. Wonderful, fantastic field evidence of glacial Lake Missoula that was over half the size of Lake Michigan. So it was a massive lake. Now, another person who was supporting of Brett's was a geologist named Ira Allison. And I'm happy to report that he was from Oregon State University, where I got my PhD. And here he is pictured with one Dr. Peter Clark, who was my PhD advisor. And so Ira Allison mapped the boulders in the Willamette Valley. And so this lake, this transient lake that came and went with the outburst floods is called Glacial Lake Allison. And he said, yes, indeed, there was a lake here. Yes, indeed, boulders were coming from places not sourced within the Willamette Valley that had lithologies that were not from this region. They were large and they must have been entrained in ice. And this lake would come and go, and at its highest, it was over 400 feet. So this is no minor lake. This is from Eugene all the way up to Portland, 400 feet deep. So we're talking a truly catastrophic amount of water moving across the land. And later models will show that it did so in 3 days. So here is one of the ice rafted erratics. I like it because it has a picnic table for scale. It was 90 tons, floated over 500 miles in an iceberg, and is now deposited 76-meter tall hill. It is one of dozens of erratics in the Willamette Valley, again with the maximum depth of the lake being 400 feet. Another person that was supportive of Brett's is a person I appreciate just because of the title. He gave a paper, The Value of Outrageous Geologic Hypothesis. Yes, that's a title I can get behind. Wikipedia describes him as a keen observer of nature, a master of logical deduction, and a brilliant synthesizer of disparate observations and ideas. I'm hoping I can get something like that on my Wikipedia page one day. I know, I like it, Rick. So one thing he says about the power of the outrageous geologic hypothesis is that it must hold true to the field evidence. It does not have to hold true to the theory, but it must be consistent with the observations of nature, and more specifically, the observations of nature, including the anomalous observations. And it's interesting that he writes this paper in 1926, 3 years after Brett's gets his paper published for the megafloods. And in my opinion, it's nail on the head. You know, you can poo-poo a whole bunch of ideas, and one really great one will go down the drain. Or you can allow them to be tested, and they will be gone anyway, and that one good one will still remain. So in 1956, J. Harlan Bretz, with two collaborators, Smith and Neff, who were from the Bureau of Reclamation, and I think they were making dams, so they had been excavating a lot. He wrote a large synthesis of all the data. And this was after they'd went up in a plane and seen the giant ripple marks by Lake Pend Oreille, where the Purcell Trench Lobe had failed. And so it was basically the epicenter of the outburst of the floods in Montana. And I don't usually read word for word when I'm giving a presentation, but this is drop the mic stuff. So the channeled scabland is almost wholly the consequence of catastrophic flooding of glacial water across this part of the Columbia River Plateau, which remade pre-glacial valleys into anastomizing complex of great river channels with huge cataracts, deep rock basins, bars attaining magnitudes unknown elsewhere on Earth. And again, that's drop the mic stuff. At this point, there's really no one that can argue with him, but notice that it took him 30 years of fortitude, 30 years of maintaining his ideas, 30 years of saying, hey, the field evidence tells me these things. If you don't believe me, go look yourself, right? So this was an unbelievable tour de force. And in my mentor, Vic Baker, went actually to meet J. Harlan Bretz when he was older. And the wonderful Vic Baker, not only is he a wonderful scientist, a good mentor, but he's an exceptional human being. And I'm sure he wanted to right the wrong. And that's why he submitted a nomination for J. Harlan Bretz to get the Penrose Medal from the GSA, which he did get. So Vic met with him, and Vic did his thesis and a lot of his work on the paleohydrology of the floods, and showed that they could reach flow rates that were 100 times greater than those of the modern day Amazon River. And once I had written a poster for AGU, and I think I said had it written as 86 times. And his only comment to my poster before I submitted it through the AGU website was, no, Andrea, it's 100 times, 100 times. And so I'll never forget that it's 100 times. So now that the Missoula floods have finally been accepted as happening, now we know that cataclysmic floods have occurred at least this one time. Other people are going out to look at further evidence. And some of the questions that remain there was, what is the interaction between this Okanagan lobe of the Cordilleran ice sheet and the water? What is the end that was coming from Glacial Lake Missoula? How big did this Glacial Lake Columbia get before it was washed out again by the inundation from Glacial Lake Missoula? What was the interaction of both of these lakes with the Purcell Trench Lobe that was the primary lobe holding back the Clark Fork River that made Glacial Lake Missoula? And so it's unbelievable, but the Missoula floods have so many wonderful secrets to tell. And here we have these rhythmites, slack water deposits. And two geologists, Richard Waite and Atwater, had basically documented these in extensive field evidence and showed that every time there was a flood, these slack water deposits were deposited down in these higher portions of the valley where they accessed at a very low energy level. And so they found in the 1990s that over 89 glacial outburst floods occurred. So not only was there one absolutely massive catastrophic flood, and the superlative is called for in this instance, and that's what Richard Waite would always say, but this happened dozens and dozens of times. And so the scoured scablands of the eastern Washington got that way from the catastrophic force that was laid down over them and scoured the tops off them over and over and over again. So still some questions remain. So everybody wanted to know, well, when were these floods actually happening? They wanted to know, when was the biggest one? Did they have a rate of occurrence that could be defined? And when was the route of the Northern Columbia here by the Okanagan Lobe? When was this route open? Because we have ice rafted boulders over here, but the Okanagan Lobe in its most southern extent would block that path and sent everything going down this other scabland track, the Cheney-Palouse. So it wasn't understood how and when the flood was occupying the western side of the Okanagan Lobe, especially because we had the giant moraine telling us about the southernmost extent of the Okanagan Lobe. So the questions that remained at that time, and these was questions that remained from the 1980s into 2015, is when did these floods occur? Which routes did they take? Did those routes change through time? And what relationship did those routes have to the Okanagan Lobe position? Did the size of these floods change through time? Now, O'Connor and Benito in 2003 published a paper, and they had some carbon ages, but those carbon ages were limited because of the reworking, because of the massive power for reworking and redepositing of sediment from the Missoula floods. And so here I come. I try hard. You see that? I have things in my way, but I try hard. So when I entered the system, we don't know about all the timing. What we do know is that we have these few ages from O'Connor that tell us that the floods may have started as young as far back as 23,000 years ago, and may have continued to 13,000 years. We also think that maybe the biggest flood happened approximately 19,000 years ago. But we also have sediment cores from the Pacific Ocean near Southern Oregon, north of a Mendocino Triple Junction. And these sediment cores, through diatoms, freshwater diatoms, and other species assemblages of forams, show us that the salinity of the water was changing dramatically, even in Southern Oregon, from about 23,000 years ago to maybe 16,000 years ago. And so this was a good proxy for floodwaters coming in. But one thing that my mentors would tell you, that some of this water, though, must be the Bonneville flood. And it's important to note that the Bonneville flood happened once, and the age on the Bonneville flood is around 18,000 years. So some of this water, and the Bonneville flood was larger in its one release of Lake Bonneville than the Missoula floods were, but it did not happen at a higher, the flux was not as great. So this is the timing we had when I entered the picture. And I can say that, as I showed you, my dinosaur with stubby arms, ignorance is bliss. So I decided I would break down my experiment as a relationship to the erratics that I had known existed from field guides, and their relationship to the ice margin and places where dams failed for the release of glacial Lake Missoula. I also targeted low-lying areas where I thought some of the smallest floods, if they were the most recent floods, would deposit erratics. And I targeted the highest erratics I could find in an effort to determine when the largest flood came through from glacial Lake Missoula. So if you imagine it, the largest flood would be the only flood to occupy that high water mark. And it would be carrying those large icebergs that would be encasing boulders that had been stripped down. Their surfaces have been stripped down because they were trapped in the glacial ice. And that is important because I was going to date these erratics using cosmogenic nuclide surface exposure dating. And in order to have a reliable age, the surface that was previously exposed to cosmic rays needs to be stripped away. So it was important that these boulders be scoured by the Missoula floods, which was more of a lahar than it was actually just a stream or a waterway, because it was chock full of such a high bed load and sediment load. And also They come from this ice sheet, this continental ice sheet, where they were tore off the surface. And also the ice had done its work of grinding them down. So I basically was rolling the dice on the fact that the natural processes that allowed the deposition of these erratics were also taking away the outer surface and allowing me to date a fresh surface the last time they were deposited. So in true Missoula flood fashion, this is not an easy undertaking. I started to hunt for these samples, and so not only do you go for samples, you need large boulders, but I needed a lithology of quartz. I needed a target lithology of quartz in order to use beryllium-10 because it was the most well-calibrated production rate. Well, Vic had told me that there is no felsic boulders on the Withrow moraine. And I said, well, I'm gonna go look. He says, I did look and there's none there. I said, oh, I'm gonna go look again. He said, I haven't found any high boulders. I haven't even found any high boulders except for the one in the Wallula Gap, but I haven't found any other ones. I said, well, I'm gonna look. He said, well, I haven't found any, but I'm gonna look. So I started looking and I started looking, and I would use Google Maps and I would say, look at there, look at that big white, that might be a granodiorite. It's a white blob. And I would get in my car and I would drive from Salem, Oregon. I would drive all the way up to Wenatchee, and I would crawl under somebody's fence that they probably didn't want to me crawling under. And I walk out there and it'd be in the middle of some trees or an orchard or something. I find out it was just a propane tank. And during this time when I'm looking for boulders that didn't exist, the first attempt of the NSF proposal was denied. And subsequently, that same proposal, as it was tweaked and changed to reply to the comments, was denied 2 more times. So in total, the NSF proposal for this work was denied a total of 3 times. So the boulders that I was hunting so desperately, I had no funding to run to analyze for the cosmogenic nuclide surface exposure dating. But my dad told me where there's a will, there's a way. And in the true fashion of Brett's, I continued. Now, here's beryllium-10, a little cartoon that I like. So we have cosmic rays that come from outer space from galactic activity and star creation and star formation. And they come traveling towards our planet, and they make it through the geomagnetic field, and they hit a quartz that has oxygen in it and silica, and it knocks out a neutron and the neutron bombardment, and it creates a beryllium-10. Knocks out an alpha particle in the end. But so it creates a beryllium-10. Beryllium-10 cannot be created any other way. And so when you measure the beryllium-10, because we know the production rate and we consider it constant, you divide it by the production rate, we know how long that boulder sat at the surface. So the trick is I need quartz. I need felsic material that people are telling me did not exist, but I continued. So what kind of boulder am I looking for? I'm looking for a big old mamma jamma. I need a big fat boulder. I need some quartz up in that boulder. I need a nice flat top so the exposure is bombarded in this flat surface and I don't have to do any correction. I want it to be completely eroded from the event. So in certain places you could actually feel that it's polished because it had been scoured by the floods and the ice. And most importantly, I want it to be in a place where I know it has not moved since deposition. So we know that moraines suffer from deflation. We know that I don't want a boulder that's on a slope because there's a probability that it's rolled since it was deposited. I want a boulder that's on a flat surface. I want a boulder that looks like it sat there and did not move since it was deposited. And because of that, I need a big boulder. And luckily, in that regard, the Missoula floods does not disappoint. Now, I hunted these boulders when people told me they did not exist. And ultimately, what I ended up doing to get my measurements made is I crushed and prepped the samples as much as I could, and I wrote what's called a seed grant to the Purdue lab, the AMS Purdue lab, where they offer free measurements in their AMS, their accelerator mass spectrometer. If you can present to them a suite of samples that has a high probability of yielding ages that are publishable. And so I applied for that seed grant, and miraculously I won that seed grant, which was great because I had already collected over 30 samples. And I'd collected them in places that people told me they did not exist. So I said to Vic, I know you said that there's no felsic boulders up on Withrow Moraine, but I want you to take me over there by where that lake is. I said, I see it on the map. I don't know how to get there. He said, okay. So I said, I'm just going to look. He said, all right. So we go up there and we start crawling up onto the moraine, and we're walking and and he looks down and he sees a little pink pebble by his foot, and it's a feldspar, and he kicks it. And I said, yep. And then I searched that moraine probably 5 times. I went there and I went in these transects where I only had 2 meters between me and somebody else, and I would just walk back and forth looking for granodiorites. And eventually I found them. And so I could date the southernmost extent of the Okanagan lobe before it retreated back. And here's why that's important. In order to understand the flow path of the Missoula floods, we have to know the position and timing of that position of the Okanagan lobe. So if I know that it's at its southernmost extent at a given time and it drops out all these boulders, I know then also that it retreats. If I also know the age of the boulders that are to the west of it, I can also tell you when the water occupied this area. If I know the age of the highest rafted boulders that are in this area, that would tell me something else. So I hunted all of these boulders, and this is what I found. In Wenatchee, the western Wenatchee, I found 3 large granodiorite boulders, and they were at 1,400 feet or 420 meters. They were all next to each other. Another thing to know about cosmogenic nuclide surface exposure dating is that just one age is really not going to do it. Because things can be rolled or displaced, or their exposure may not have been set to 0 when they were deposited, it's a game of statistics. And you want to have more than one boulder, as many as you can really, but you have to be particular about the ones you sample, because if one looks displaced or one looks like it's rolled, you might be corrupting your data set. So first thing you need to know the geologic context of what this boulder is telling you. What hypothesis are you testing? And does it look like this boulder has sat there since its deposition and not moved? And what I found was that at 18.2 thousand years ago, the highest rafted boulders, there was a cluster of 3 of them in West Wenatchee, and one at the highest watermark in Wallula Gap. They all happened at the same time. And so what that tells me is that the water that came to this area, not only was it a massive amount of water because it was the highest rafted boulders that I could find, but it came to this place while the Okanagan lobe was north of the northern Columbia River. You see, it cannot come this route unless the Okanagan lobe is north of the northernmost extent of the Columbia River. So now from these ages, I can tell I have this part of the story deconvolved, that a massive flood, 10 times 10 to the 6 meters cubed per second, came from the east, took the northern route of the Columbia River down through Wenatchee, where it backwashed up these rivers and came down and got caught at the Wallula Gap, where it backfilled up and created ephemeral Lake Lewis. And this massive amount of water happened at 18.2 thousand years ago. What else I found is that the Spirit Lake giant ripple marks in the Purcell Trench lobe were about the same time. So we know that the Purcell Trench lobe, there are boulders that were on the moraine of the Purcell Trench lobe. And so they basically indicate the last time the Purcell Trench lobe failed, catastrophically releasing glacial Lake Missoula. And when it did, it created these giant ripple marks that if you walk through them, they look like hills. I had seen them on a map, and then when I got to them, I thought, I actually said out loud, where are these hills coming from? They were so big, even though I knew I was driving to giant ripple marks, I couldn't even figure it out in the first 15 minutes. So there, on this place, the boulders are the size of buses. I'm not exaggerating. The boulders are the size of buses here, because the velocity of water coming from glacial Lake Missoula is insane. And it's ripping up large portions of these mountainous areas and just dropping them out as it reduces in energy just a little bit, and is creating these giant ripple marks. So we know that happened at 15.7, 15.6. We know that Wenatchee Bar and the Ephrata Fan, which is this area by the lower Grand Coulee, happened about 15.4 and 15.6 thousand years ago. Then we know that the Withrow Moraine actually was at its northernmost extent at 15.4 thousand years ago. And so what that tells us is 18.2 thousand years ago, this Okanagan lobe was north of the Columbia River. And then between 18.2 and 15.4, it got all the way down to its southernmost extent. And it was climbing uphill onto the Columbia River Plateau, onto the Columbia Plateau. And then it retreated after that. So this, because we have the timing of when these boulders were on this western part of the Okanagan lobe and the timing of its southernmost extent, we can talk about how long it took to get to its southernmost extent. Then we have the Pateros Bar, which is the lower lying area in Wenatchee, talking about the more recent, smaller floods. We have Panghorn Bar, the lower lying Panghorn Bar, which is the similar area, and the Mattawa Fan. All of these are, we think, related to smaller megafloods. And this area was occupied with floods even after the demise of the Purcell Trench lobe. So now the question is, where was this secondary body of water? If it wasn't the glacial Lake Missoula and it was creating a smaller mega flood, where was it coming from? Was it coming from underneath the glacier? Was it another glacier lake up to the north? And that's provoked a new set of questions. So when we look at it in this chronological order, we say at 20,000 to 18,000 years ago, the Purcell Trench lobe has extended to dam glacial Lake Missoula with quite a fortitude, because it's creating a dam that's very large because we're getting these absolutely massive floods. But the Cordilleran ice sheet had not advanced to the point where the Okanagan lobe had dammed the northern reach of the Columbia River. Then at 18,000 years, we have further advance of the ice. And again, we might be starting to dam the northern Columbia because we see no ice rafted boulders in this area between the 18.2 and 14,000 years ago. At 18,000 to 16,000, the Okanagan lobe has descended. The Purcell Trench lobe is large. We are now, the floods that are breaking out from glacial Lake Missoula are coming into contact with the Okanagan lobe and being sent south or even southeast toward the Telford Crab Creek track or the Cheney Palouse track. And this is where we get all those fantastic scablands, where these things were probably, over the 100 floods, many of them probably occupied this area. Then at 16 to 15,000 years ago, the Okanagan lobe retreats. It starts to retreat from the southernmost extent and finally retreats to where it allows more boulders to come through here, ice rafted boulders and flood deposited boulders into the Wenatchee area and Moses and lower down by the Saddle Mountains area. So what did I get out of all that? I got a paper published in Geology, and it is because of my mentors, Jim O'Connor and Vic Baker, who believed in me, Bruce Bjornstad, who led me through, and my advisor, Peter Clark, who cheered me on the entire way, and my husband, Kevin Conrad, who's also a geologist, who would sit there with a sledgehammer slamming on a granodiorite in the hot Eastern Washington sun, while I sang songs, "Get on out of here, rattlesnake, get on out of here, go," because I did not want to be bitten by a rattlesnake. So not only did we get a paper published, but we also got the cover, baby. That's right. So it was hard fought, but it was worth it. And this picture is by my buddy, Bruce Bjornstad, who's a co-author on the paper. So the story of the Missoula floods is that you should never give up. You should always continue even when it's hard. And you should trust your instincts, especially as a geologist. If you see field evidence, you should respect the field evidence. And so I just wanted to thank you guys for taking the time to listen to all my stories about the Missoula floods, and the wonderful and fabulously supportive Jim O'Connor and Vic Baker, who taught me all about the story of J. Harlan Bretz while we were in the truck looking for boulders.
All right, thank you very much. I mean, I'd give you a round of applause, but it's kind of, yeah. So I'd like to open up the session for questions. If you guys have any, or speak up, I guess, right?
Stop the share so we can see you.
Stop the share. Stop the share.
Oh, that's better than stop the steal.
Oh God, thank you for that. Thank you for that.
A very good talk, by the way. Thank you.
Oh,
I like your style.
I'm glad you liked it. Yeah, probably, like I said, I've probably seen some of you guys up there in the Friends of the Pleistocene then, which is crazy. Now all the way down in Southern California, and
You weren't born yet. I was there in '83.
Oh wow! So you were there with Vic and Jim the whole time.
With Richard Waite and Brian Atwater.
Yeah, Richard is entertainment, isn't he?
Well, he was the head of the volcanology, the Cascades Volcano Observatory, and after the end of the FOP trip, he took us out to Mount St. Helens, and we were like, you know, there wasn't a single green leaf yet. It was just spectacular.
Yeah. Oh yeah, his book was great too, and he actually had a hypothesis. This chronology that my boulders revealed was very similar to Richard's hypothesis for the timing of and routing of the floods. He was very happy when he saw my ages. Yeah.
Well, I was surprised to see you had 89 floods. Because
well, I don't think that. Yeah, Richard would say don't put that number. 89 is like, he says it's more like 102 or 106.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because I was up there, you don't know this guy, Martin Stout. He was a professor at Long Beach, at Cal State LA. And the reason I didn't go to Long Beach, and he's a landslide guy, but he got his PhD in Washington State in Real Rocks. And that's why we went on the FOP trip. But we're all in this class up there, and we're all programmed to see landslides. And Brian Atwater is presenting at the last stop his chronology of the number of floods. And he had something in the 70s or 80s.
Yes.
But that's not what he published. He published something in the 50s in his geology paper. And now I firmly believe the reason is because of a question I asked him. And because the last stop, we have an exposure of those beautiful rhythmites up there. And then there's rhythmites below us, and then there's more below that. And he's adding them all up. And at the end, I said, Brian, I believe we're sitting on a landslide, and we're looking at the headscarp, and I thought he was going to pass out. And we actually became pretty good friends after that. and he retracted, he recalculated his number because it was bloody obvious this wasn't right. I was very impressed with the picture you showed of those, that we didn't see that canyon back then. So
yeah, that canyon is a private canyon that you can't get access on private property, but Bruce Bjornstad has been out there so long making his field guides that he gets access to these places with his drone. And so Bruce is fantastic. So if you guys have a chance and you want to see some awesome video, go to Bruce Bjornstad's Ice Age floods, and you will see drone video like you've never seen. And the last time we were out getting boulders, he takes his drone and I'm sampling boulders with my sledgehammer, and he's sitting next to me operating his drone. And this is how we always do it. And I'm sitting with my sledgehammer and he's operating a drone. So he goes, "You know what I just did, Andrea?" I said, "No." He goes, "I sent it up there for 20 minutes till it ran out of its battery and I forgot to turn it on."
Andrea, question? Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. Excellent talk. Brought back lots of memories from my days on various FOP trips and running around up there. But you, as a total aside, you of course brought up the name of William Morris Davis. And that reminded me of the classic arguments that Davis had with one of the Penks. There was Albrecht Penck and his son, both of them Germans, obviously, who had worked in Africa and developed the sort of the arid land concept of landscape evolution, whereas Davis, early on, around the turn of the century, the last century, of course, had worked in New England, had developed the whole concept of landscape evolution through the famous descriptive youth maturity, old age, et cetera, et cetera. And so for Davis, who looked at uniformitarianism as biblical, if you'll forgive the expression, and then later on, it was gutsy enough and kind enough to give homage to Bretz for his work on the whole catastrophism versus uniformitarianism and all the arguments that went out on at that time. There is lots of interesting stories. This was all going on at the same time, in the 30s anyway, when related to German nationalism and how geology got involved in that, who is better, and then I won't bother you with all those sort of details. But it's fascinating to see that, and I wasn't aware that good old William Morris Davis did give good credit to J. Harlan Bretz, and ultimately accepted the concept that uniformitarianism is nothing more than a series of catastrophism, amortized over time. And so that's what it is. And we have to thank these old guys for their mapping and for their thinking and their philosophy about our field of science. But thank you for bringing all that up again. Well done, a great presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I am told a story, and I can't remember where I heard it, but it was a story. Oh, it was Jim O'Connor in the truck again. It was Jim O'Connor, and I think Vic was in the truck too. And they said that one of their students or whatever had worked with Stephen Jay Gould, and there had been an iguana in a tank in the cafeteria room. And he went away for a summer field trip, and he came back, and in the middle of that, the iguana had died, and someone took it out of the tank. And he goes over in the cafeteria and he looks at it and he goes, "You see, I was right. Punctuated equilibrium." Someone had replaced it with a frog.
There you go.
The lizard had died, and someone put a frog in the tank. And he said, "You see, I was right. Punctuated equilibrium." And that's the story. Yeah, you're right. It's a series of catastrophic events, can be the same thing. And again, you have to respect the field evidence. If it's there, to act like it isn't is just a variation of denial. Right? And as geologists, that's what you have to do. To ignore something, you do it at your detriment.
And recognizing also that our favorite hypothesis will be rejected in a few years.
Exactly. And hopefully you can reject it yourself.
Ideally.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have spent an entire year denying things.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I was disappointed that you didn't use the, when they awarded Brett's the Penrose Medal, they said, we are all catastrophists now.
Yeah, well, I do like that when they did award him the medal, he told his son, this is another story from Vic, they said, well, yeah, they have to give me the award now. Everybody else died.
Roy and I are hoping for the same thing, yes.
Yeah, and another scientist, I think it was Hoffman, he came to give a talk at Oregon State about snowball Earth. And he said, well, you know, science, it moves forward one funeral at a time. Yeah, so that's what Brett said, you know, and give it a lot of credit to Vic for making sure that Brett's got credit, you know.
Yeah.
And Vic was instrumental in getting that plaque there at Dry Falls. Another story is at Dry Falls Visitor Center. I don't know how many of you guys have been to Dry Falls, but it has a little cute little visitor center. It has these books and little videos and trinkets. And why we go there is because it has the bathroom, and it's an only bathroom there in like, I don't know how many miles. So Vic and I pull up there to go to use the bathroom. We're going to look for boulders. And Vic has his geology hat on. And there's a ranger there in the information center, and he's had this video on a loop, and the video is of the Missoula floods with Vic talking on the video. The ranger must have seen this video maybe hundreds of times of Vic with his geology hat talking about the Missoula floods and the potholes and blah, blah, blah. And Vic comes charging up the stairs and looks at the guy and says, where's the bathroom? And the geologist, and the ranger looks at Vic and looks at the TV and looks at Vic. Like he looked exactly like his picture. And I was laughing because Vic didn't even notice. He just had to go to the bathroom. Oh no, Vic said, do I need a key to the bathroom? He said, no. And then later we found this now in front of the visitor center, there's this little hut where you can get French fries and ice cream. So we sat down and got a snack, and the guy at the information center, the little ranger, he came out and says, I've closed the center, but you can come in for a personal tour. And so we got a personal tour of the information center. Yeah. But he was probably thinking he was losing his mind. Watch that video one too many times, and Vic Baker comes charging up the stairs asking if he needs a key to the bathroom.
So I actually have a technical question.
Okay.
So my understanding is that Lake Missoula would fill up, it would float the ice dam, and it would blow out the bottom. It would blow out it would float the ice dam. It would flow underneath it, which would ultimately blow the thing out.
Mm-hmm.
But why didn't the one that dammed the Columbia do the same thing?
Well, this is an interesting question.
Or am I wrong on the Missoula?
Well, no, this is not well known, and Richard has a lot of opinions of this. So the next time you're on an FOP and Richard is around, ask him. He thinks it's a hydrologic, like you just expressed, the hydrologic buoyancy that it lifts up and basically gets pushed up and breaks out. But no one knows if it could fracture, right? You can see when you look at the maps that the Purcell trench lobe, that groove there is still very clear. It's very beveled, that bedrock, and it goes all the way through to another side where it looks like it could have been buttressed a little bit. Whereas you don't see that so much in the Columbia, over by the glacial Lake Columbia. It's more of just kind of a mound of ice. It's not actually, the Purcell trench lobe is actually like a tongue of ice if you use the actual groove in the bedrock as a representation of its occupancy. But Richard has a lot of opinions on this, and there's been a lot of numerical models, and he's thought a lot about the numerical models of how to get the Purcell trench lobe to fail. He's had a lot of heated discussions with like Vic and other people.
So nothing has changed since 28.
No, but if you guys are on the last FOP, they led it together, Richard and Vic. So it was the first time they were hanging out together. And they were happy as clams. Actually, they were chatting in the truck, and I was like, oh, look, we'll chit chat.
I think we've got over the manacled bracelets that we put on ourselves and our theories these days.
Yeah, that's great. And they are actually on a new paper, the paper that Jim O'Connor just put out on like a total reconciliation of the floods. I think he put about 6 or 8 months ago. Both Richard and Vic are on that paper. I think Richard gave Jim a hard time, but it got through.
Is there any, does a 3D animation of what occurred exist anywhere?
No, a 3D animation does not exist, but there's modeling by Derlinger, and then a new model that came out from Vic's student. So Vic had a recent student get his PhD, and he modeled basically the flow of the Missoula flood. So the amount of water that would take to reach the high water mark of the boulders and stuff that we have, the highest water mark, doesn't seem to be enough water in glacial Lake Missoula to do that. So there's some missing water. And where is that water coming from? So Vic got a student who was doing some modeling of the outburst of the flood and its flow path. And they were trying to see, hey, where could some more water come from? Is there a fingerprint of where it would have to come to reconcile with the geologic data?
So Andrea, do the boulders have to be rafted, or is it possible that some of them were just entrained in the flow? Are they all rafted in glacier?
No, some of them were entrained and some of them were rafted. You can tell, it's weird that the ones that are rafted are literally less rounded, and then the ones that are, you can tell, are actually from the flood, like the Ephrata fan, which would be, there was a natural dam at the base of Lower Grand Coulee, and Lower Grand Coulee, at a southern extent, that dam failed. And when it did, it made this enormous fan of, you guys have seen it, I don't know how many boulders, right? Just car-sized boulders, and those ones are still smooth to the touch. You can find places on them, so they've been exposed for 15,000 years, and they feel like, a countertop. And it's because they were just basically in a rock tumbler.
Yeah, I'm in Spokane actually, and I would agree with that. But
yeah, right.
Everything around here is tumbled, and it's pretty well sorted too. They build retaining walls out of everything that's more or less the size of your dresser or furniture size is pretty common. Yeah. And then there's houses built out of cobble-sized stuff, and it's pretty well sorted, and sub-rounded would be the term.
Yeah.
Wouldn't necessarily be rounded yet though here.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And in the Ephrata fan, they're not really rounded either. They're more like the corners are taken off, and then I know, like when you get closer to Spokane, they get rounder and more sorted.
Like the one you showed with the picnic table on it, that's more subangular.
Yes, and that one had gone all the way down to Willamette. So that one was in the ice. And the ones that are the highest rafted ones that are in western Wenatchee are also kind of flat and extended like that. They're not like the Ephrata fan or Spokane boulders. They're nothing like that. But interestingly, I will say, the ones that are on the Spirit Lake ripple marks, those are just enormous and not rounded, and I just have no business. They seem to not follow the rules of nature. I mean, they're beyond comprehension. They just sit there, and I mean, obviously I can't imagine any of the Missoula flood processes, but once I was out sampling the Mesozoic granite that was underneath the Columbia River basalts. So it's at a place where the cataract peeled back at the upper Grand Coulee. I think you guys probably know the place if you've been on those field trips. So it's by a Steamboat Rock, where the basalt got ripped off the Mesozoic granite. And I was there sampling the granite, and Vic was with me, and then I was on an Inselberg, and about a football field away, Jim had gone to another Inselberg, and Vic was playing with his camera and trying to take a picture of Jim. And I was realizing that the water had come streaming over that area, like massive amounts of water, enough to rip it back and pull back and cut back the cataract. And so I was looking up and I thought, I just can't imagine the water. And so I said, hey, Vic, can you imagine that much water coming over this ridge here and just pulling back this basalt, ripping it off this Mesozoic granite? Can you imagine that much water? And he's still playing with his phone. And he said, Andrea, I've been trying for 40 years. And so it's not just me. It is a wonderful, magical thing. But it, make no bones about it, it is a destructive force. When I would have to say, of all the things I've seen studying the Missoula floods, those bus-sized boulders on Spirit Lake ripple marks are, just not something that, it doesn't seem like something that could happen on the surface of the planet. Oh, and then one other thing I wanted to say.
Hey, before you say that, sounds like you have your next project.
Exactly. So people were talking about human beings and being able to witness the floods. And so some of our youngest ages say that it's off by about 500 to 1,000 years, depending on the error, 2 sigma or 1 sigma error. But what is interesting is that, I don't know who it was. I was giving a talk. No, somebody was giving a talk. It was Vic or Bruce or somebody. And there's this hill near Richland in Kirkland area. And it's a hill that is high enough that it would have stood above ancient glacial Lake Lewis. It would have been higher than the top of glacial Lake Lewis. And the native people still refer to it as the hill above the water. And so you're right, I can't remember who said it would be in the oral history, that probably the oral history is going to be the evidence that indicates, did human beings witness the floods? And so that has been something that's very interesting to me. And I have a collaborator. We might take some samples of some sediments in Glacial Lake, from Glacial Lake, Missoula, probably out there with Larry Smith. I think you guys are going on an FOP with Larry Smith. And see if we can figure out if human beings were there and witnessed Glacial Lake Missoula or the Missoula floods there. Richard did a paper that had, you saw that he had those Clovis points. He did, I think it was published in 2016, Clovis Point arrowheads in a cache north of Wenatchee. So, there's definitely activity. It's just where in time, how can you deconvolve? Basically, this will be an issue of the error on an age.
Andrea?
And right now, that's where we are. We're basically within error.
Along those lines, the great talk, by the way. Did you consider, because the limited number of samples you had means of 3 samples. Did you consider the idea that maybe your youngest sample is the actual age, and that you have a certain amount of inheritance in your cosmogenic dating that would be pretty explainable?
Yeah, I think it might be the inheritance is an issue that if you rip off, if you have a meter of exposure gone, you really have taken away all of the spalogenic signal. So the mugenic signal can go down at some depth, but to create beryllium-10, a muon exposure is going to be pretty small in comparison to the spalogenic component that really the signal attenuates with depth exponentially. If, for instance, the ages of 18.2 did not cluster so well, I would think that would be something worth considering. But some of these spots, the ages cluster so specifically. I think if there was inheritance, we would see a larger spread. And by the way, we did sample rocks that we did find inheritance, and they have been reported in the supplement and discussed in the supplement. So no.
That's good. That's good. It's kind of unusual to actually do the sampling without getting an inheritance in a boulder.
Absolutely. And I am not one of those people. I had a geochronologist tell me once, we ran 18 rocks, but we only got 4 ages that we liked.
I've got a question.
That just drives me crazy. So I always put every measurement in the supplement, every measurement. So if I don't report it in the text as part of the data for interpreting, first it needs a significant reason. And it needs to be reported in the supplement with the raw data and everything there.
Did you have to do a t-test, significance t-test on that? We
had done a t-test and another test, but some of our populations aren't high enough. So I can't remember this. I think it was a t-test or another statistical test that's slipping my mind right now. But we were on a moraine in near, what's that fancy lake where everybody goes and that had a recent fire? Oh, I can't remember. Anyway, where?
Tahoe?
No, it's the one in Washington, and it's
Chelan?
Which one?
Chelan or
Yeah,
Chelan?
we're near Lake Chelan. And there was a moraine that actually you could see that if you looked at the LiDAR, that the lobe went up kind of this hill. And we're on this moraine and we knew that it was going to be the retreat of basically the northern Okanagan. And there was like a finger that came out of the northern Okanagan. And Jim O'Connor was there with me. And we were on top of the moraine. We were on the crest of the moraine. And he said, "Get that one, Andrea." And I said, and this one was, bigger than a bus. It was about the size of an SUV, this erratic. And I said, "I don't know, that one, it looks a little bit off the center of the crest. It looks like it could have rolled." And he said, no, it doesn't look like it rolled. So I think it looked like it could roll. No, it doesn't look like it rolled. It's okay, I'm a graduate student. I take the sample. I take 4 other samples. That was the only sample that wasn't within error of the other ones. And it was 9,000 years and everything else was 13,000 years. So I shouldn't have listed. And now when I go on an FOP, I say somebody by the name of Dr. James E. O'Connor made me sample it.
I have a question. Do you have, looking at the flow rates, I know it's more of a hydro question, but are you able to determine how many weeks or days it took from the cataclysmic flow to empty to go to static? Were you talking about a matter of?
Yeah, so.
And by the way, thank you very much for the speech. And my dad got a degree at OSU in microbiology, so I'm a big Corvallis friend as well.
Yay.
Anyway, fantastic.
Yeah.
You're a beaver believer, and I can see that.
Yeah, go Beavs. Yes, Derlinger does a model on that, and Vic has had students do models on that, and it takes about, unbelievably, only 3 days to drain the entirety of glacial Lake Missoula.
Wow.
So there's a paper you can look up, DERLINGER, and it actually has, I think, a little movie that you can click on, and you can watch the drainage over the mapped area that I showed you.
That's hard to imagine. That's amazing.
It's absolutely insane.
Is there a lot of fluid mechanics equations in that paper?
I think so. I think that's all that Derlinger does. I do remember it takes him a long time to run that model. the computer space required was, I guess, really significant. Because when they were tweaking it, they had to go actually up to his computer that was a really strong computer to watch it.
So he's looking at head pressure, he's looking at elevation change, and
Yeah.
these pinch zones, I imagine,
Yeah.
velocity rates and obstruction.
Yeah, the pinch zones were, I think, the really what was, so basically his model was showing that with the amount of water in Glacial Lake Missoula, you couldn't get past some of these pinch zones and into some of these areas that the geologic indicates, that the geology evidence indicates the waters were there.
Wow.
So
I guess the
that's
analogy is like a hose, a hose of water where you put your thumb on the hose and you induce pressure, and at those pinch zones, you must have had incredible flow rates and increase in acceleration.
Yeah, so that's why at this Wallula Gap behind me, you have a real increase of acceleration because everything is stacked up behind it, creating that ephemeral glacial Lake Lewis. That was the lake that I told you the Native Americans have the oral history of, the hill that actually stood above the ephemeral glacial Lake Lewis, that the Native people still call land above the water. Well, thank you guys so much for coming to the talk. I hope you liked hearing about the Missoula floods and me being in the car with Jim O'Connor and Vic Baker. I'm glad I get to share it because they are truly two really good people. And
thank you for presenting.
Yeah.
I know I learned a lot.
Oh, good. So if you guys have any good ideas about getting internships for the students or good jobs for the students or any way to get them in the pipeline to get really good jobs where they can use all their good skills and apply all their CSULB field knowledge that Rick Bill has given them.
Yeah.
We need to figure out how we get the students what they need to get the best jobs they can when they graduate. So thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. I will tell you, having cut my geotechnical teeth in Southern California and then being up here at the headwaters of the flood in Spokane and working in the industry I work in, boulders matter. You can get a PhD and worry about beryllium and everything like that, but at the end of the day, I just in the last couple of weeks with jobs over in Portland, in clays, the distal end of this business, and then the boulders involved in other places, such as I have a job in San Onofre right now, where contractors need to know how big those blue schist chunks in the San Onofre breccia might be, and to be a geologist and understand why behind it.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
That's one of the avenues we can explore here because,
I would love to drill a core into the Willamette Valley and date how many and look at how many inundations of the Missoula floods came through there.
Oh yeah, even here where I'm sitting in Spokane Valley, because I know exactly what the top 10 feet look like just by driving around construction sites.
Yeah.
But it'd be really, but I'm sitting just off the valley edge here on basalt and an old lake deposit too, my house anyway. And so it's complicated, but it's also, to understand this complication is really cool for the student too, or the job prospect looking student, because at the end of the day, these kind of details, you kind of get muddied by going too far into it sometimes, but at the end of the day, there's lots of really basic guys out there that are just running bulldozers around or architects that are trying to build buildings that want to know what's going on too. So.
Oh yeah,
pretty
well,
cool.
yeah, I can't imagine drilling it. Like my uncle used to drill water wells in Moses Lake.
Yep.
It's like,
yeah. And there's plenty of well drillers, if they get 5 or 6 feet into something hard, though, you know what? This must be rock. Let's stop. Well,
yeah.
Somebody needs to tell them no, keep going.
I don't know if I know how to make somebody else host. Where do I do that?
You basically just put your cursor over the South Coast or scgs.mgmt@gmail.com thing, and you click more.
Where is it?
So you look at for the word's escaping me now, but basically you just go over to the South Coast participant, or go over to the participants, hover over scgs.mgmt@gmail.com.
Okay.
Click more, and then you should be able to make me a host.
Let's see if I can do this. Participants, I'm gonna find you. Yes, okay, I'm finding you. And yeah. Oh, I did it! I think I did it. Oh, wait. Oh, I did it! Woo!
Yay.
Sweet, thank you.
We're still new to this.
I never let my students be host.
Yeah, we're still trying to figure it out, you know?
Yeah.
We did have another guy last year taking care of all of the Zoom meetings and stuff like that. And since he's no longer an officer, we've now jumped on board to learn all of the capabilities. And so it's kind of a learning curve, but
yeah,
you know.
Okay, well, I hope everybody had fun. I had fun.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that talk. Thank you very much, and good luck at Cal State Long Beach. I don't know how long you've been there, but very exciting.
Yeah, I hope we stay in contact. I got to come out and visit you guys so we can get some of those internships and everything going.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Nice meeting everybody.
Bye.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you.